Well,
Boker Tov and good morning. I am Rabbi Stephen Moskowitz of Congregation Lador Vador, and this is Morning Musings, my Monday morning spiritual kickstart to the week. At least that's what I hope and how I hope it serves. So I'm joined, I always invite friends of mine and colleagues from near and far. This friend and colleague is from very near, Pastor Jeff Prey from Oyster Bay. First Presbyterian Church. He has been at the church for 24 years. And I'm so thrilled, Jeff, that you're joining us this morning and going to share some of your wisdom.
well, thank you for the invitation and for reaching out. Good to be with you.
Thank you. So first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your church? Even though we're neighbors, I bet that many people in our congregation have not been to your church.
Church has been here for a while, dates back to the 1840s. I know this will tie in a little bit with the discussion that we're going to have, but we are the boyhood church of Theodore Roosevelt. Many people associate him with Christ Episcopal Church across the street. Our story is he went there after his second marriage. His first wife died. His second wife was Episcopalian. He went there for domestic bliss reasons, but his heart stayed with us. That's our story. We're sticking with it. They have a different story. But you know, it's good to be here. Oyster Bay is, as you have discovered, it's a wonderful little town, a town that very much is connected with Theodore Roosevelt. We're part of the Presbyterian denomination, which would also have fit in well with Theodore Roosevelt. They were Dutch, so there was a connection there with the Dutch Reformed Church. And I think that when they were out here in Oyster Bay, we were the closest to a Dutch Reformed, so this is where they attended. But I've enjoyed my time here, great congregation, and again, just appreciate one of the things about Oyster Bay, and I think is a delightful aspect, is the good and cordial relationship between religious leaders of all different aspects. And it's great to be able to connect with Steve, with you, with the Jewish population. It's good to be able to be together. And I think that we do that pretty well in Oyster Bay.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say, I really enjoy our lunches when we go out to lunches.
Which hopefully we'll go out again sometime.
We have not been out to lunch in person in some time now. And I just have to say again, and I know I've told you this personally, when you and your colleagues came to our synagogue on the Shabbat after the shooting in Pittsburgh, it still means the world to us and meant so much to my congregation and to me personally when you stood on our bima and offered your support at that moment. And I know you're from Pittsburgh as well, so there was that connection for you too.
I'll start cracking up. It was a moving time for us. And there, I could feel the tears welling as you were bringing that memory back, and that was it was a moving time for us. And appreciate the invitation again to be a part of that.
Well, just to have been together was, I think, the right response. I thought that was quite a difficult moment. It still is to think about. So what I wanted to talk to you about and to gain insight and learn from you was about religious images and statues and what role, if any, they play in your church and in your faith, and then sort of move our discussion to some of the current controversy about statues and taking some down and keeping some up, and actually back to Teddy Roosevelt, where we have a wonderful statue of Teddy Roosevelt in our very own town. So that's one of the reasons why I thought I would talk to you. So go ahead.
Well, interestingly, I mean, I take, at the risk of taking a somewhat flippant view of church history, but I prefer flippancy over other approaches, is the Reformed Church. Personally, I find there to be tremendous value in visual objects that aid in devotional practices, in worship, because particularly these days we are a visual culture. That said, there is the risk of those objects taking on a life of their own that they are never meant to take on, and replacing what they're meant to stand for. If all of a sudden we focus overly much on the objects as opposed to God, who stands behind them, then the objects are a detriment. from our history, the reformers took the view of the objects were becoming a detriment, largely because I think in practice they had become a detriment in the 1500s. So part of the history of the Reformed Church was that we were iconoclasts. We actually tore down a thing or two, a statue or two, a window or two, got rid of an object or two. So that in general, Protestant churches are a lot more Spartan than Catholic churches. In general, there are certainly exceptions to that rule. That's part of our history, which isn't to say that we don't, there are objects, there are symbols, there are, things to observe in Protestant sanctuaries, in Presbyterian churches.
So I think there's stained glass windows in your church.
There are stained glass windows in our
that
church.
have images.
There are depictions of, we have the lamb, which is a symbol of sacrifice from the Hebrew scriptures, is a symbol of Christ in the Christian tradition. Pictures of angels, there are depictions of symbols in the windows, and certainly there are Protestant churches with unbelievable stained glass windows. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City has just spectacular windows in it. So that is, there are certainly images in Protestant churches.
It's not necessarily a hard line in it.
Not even close to a hard line, no.
Yeah.
Back in the 1500s, there were some for whom it was a hard line, and you will find a number of New England congregational churches with clear glass windows. Nothing between you and God's creation.
Interesting.
Except hopefully for some insulation, because, it's New England. It's cold winters.
You always have the quip.
Yeah.
I appreciate that about you, Jeff. So, but just to clarify something we talked about before, so you might have an image of a cross, but without Jesus on the cross.
Yes, and not because we are opposed to images of Jesus. Excuse me a minute. There we go. Put on the do not disturb button. Not because we're opposed to images of Jesus, but it was just because it was more of a differentiation between the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, where it's just, okay, if you're going to have Jesus on the cross with a focus on the crucifixion, which is an important element of our faith, it's almost like we've decided we will not have Jesus on the cross. We'll focus on the resurrection. We don't deny the crucifixion. The Catholics don't deny the resurrection. It's just a way of differentiating yourselves at a time when differentiation was important back in the 1500s. Less so now.
I very much appreciate also what you said earlier about that the image can become the focus.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often taught this, the image that I think about in the religious symbol that is very common for Jews is the Mezuzah on the doorposts.
Mm-hmm.
And people can begin to think of that as a protective amulet, as opposed to, a vehicle to help bring holiness into their home, or to connect them with God. But if it becomes sort of like this amulet, then I think it becomes a dangerous in some ways.
Actually, interestingly, you bring that up. Just last week, we have an online Bible study. It's a practice called Lectio Divina, just a devotional reading of a passage. We were doing Deuteronomy 6, and is it Shema? How do you pronounce?
Yes.
We were talking about exactly that, because put it on your doorpost. We talked about the Mezuzah. And it just the fact that I think that there is value in that. It's a shame that we Protestants, we Presbyterians, if you had a reminder going in and out, God's word should animate my life, whether I'm in the house or whether I'm out of the house. That's helpful. But as you say, then it becomes I touch it to protect me. Not so good.
Right. But, and one of the things I like to teach, and what I believe in very strongly, is, the act of touching the Mezuzah. Hopefully that will give you a consciousness, like, okay,
yeah,
I want to bring shalom. I want to bring peace into the home. So if you kiss the mezuzah and then scream at everyone in the house, I mean, like, you're kind of really missing the point about what the mezuzah is supposed to do. And if you just see it as this sort of creating this protective kind of bubble, it can become a dangerous icon and become an idol, an idolatry.
And that's the dual-edged sword. There's a risk but but if you turn your back on it because of the risk, you lose the value of it. And we don't, I mean, I would love to have, I'm thinking I should get one, put it on my door, a visual reminder. God's word should animate me amongst the people whom I see today.
Well, so if you ever want to, you know who to call.
Okay, there we are. Okay, you've got sources.
I can help you out there.
Yeah, there we go.
So next time, God willing, I'm in Jerusalem. I'll bring
Okay,
you
better
back.
than Amazon. There we
Yeah,
are. Okay.
So let's shift the conversation to statues, because I think that's a very interesting and natural transition and segue. So part of what we seem to have discovered is that any symbol and has a double-edged sword. That was your word. And
that would be my, yeah.
So how do you respond to the controversy about statues, about Teddy Roosevelt, and so on?
It is a challenge, but it's also, it's a double-edged sword. There's a challenge to hear the perspective of those who are offended by statues. And it's a challenge to remember what those statues mean and why they were put up. And unfortunately, that's a challenge that calls for nuance and discussion, which is not exactly what's going on in a lot of places now. Should some statues be torn down? Probably yes. Am I an expert in deciding that? Absolutely not.
Are there some that it would be obvious to you to tear down?
To be honest with you, I don't know that many statues, but I think I mentioned to you earlier, just had this discussion with some other friends last night. I was not aware of the history behind a lot of the statues in the South that were put up following the Reconstruction, following the Civil War, as more of an in-your-face, we're going to put up statues of these people who were leading the fight to keep you in slavery. That's a troubled history.
Right.
There are statues that bring more nuance to it. In fact, the one that I originally thought, the statue of the Lincoln with the Emancipation, I didn't know anything about it. My initial impression was that's a bad visual. Lincoln standing over a slave, hand on the head. It seems to be very much unequals.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently the intention of the sculpture, and I need to find out more about it, the freed slave is in the process of rising up, is in the process of standing, has a gaze that sets off in the future, that there's more to that statue than I understood. And that's where I think it's helpful to understand what the statues are and then make an informed decision instead of just toppling them.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Your own history, you just shared that it was tearing down statues was sort of the initial revolution.
Well, yeah, it's not something I'm proud of, but
but that was part of what gave rise to the faith that is yours.
Well, not gave rise. I would call that was part of the expression of the faith at a time of similar passions.
Okay.
The religious passions of the day. When I read about church history, I am astounded at what I see from the reformers, the vitriol that they expressed against the Pope and the Catholic Church. And it's like, holy smokes.
Right. Well, there is plenty of vitriol right now.
Exactly. There are certainly parallels.
Yeah, but so the thing is, the difficulty I have is that, I agree with you. The statues in the South of Confederate generals, I absolutely think they should come down. I mean, it's not just, I might be offended, but for others, they're symbols of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And that shouldn't be in the town square. It's one thing in a museum, in a context and so forth, maybe, but in a town square, it's the exact wrong message.
Yeah.
The others, it's the Lincoln, the statue of Lincoln that you mentioned. I read recently that, Frederick Douglass, that there was a controversy about the image, that some had wanted to sort of them standing at the same height, if you will. And I think those are complicated. Teddy Roosevelt, the statue that was moved inside at the museum, that makes sense to me, to move it inside where it can be framed.
And framing our history is important.
Right, but so we have a statue in town in Oyster Bay of Teddy Roosevelt on a horse, looking gallant, Rough Rider, and there's he was far from a perfect man,
Hmm.
but he was president of the United States. He lived in Oyster Bay. I mean, I don't, if we took down the statue of every single person who had done some bad things or even terrible things in their own personal story, I don't think we'd have any statues of people left.
Zero. Yeah.
Right.
We are
So,
all flawed, and we can't. If we turn our backs on our flaws and our imperfections, if we don't frame it, as you say, by moving the statue inside, then we will learn nothing, and be at risk of repeating things that shouldn't be repeated.
yeah, and that's exactly sort of my thinking. I mean, and I take the teaching of Judaism about idolatry that,
Mhm.
well, as soon as you put up something of someone,
It's at
it,
risk. Yeah.
you got that. And you use the phrase, it's the double-edged sword. I mean,
Yeah.
you invest too much in either that moment that you're depicting or that person's history, which all of us, as I said, have done things that we're proud of and things
Mhm.
that we would just assume forget.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of difficulty with that, and we do have a lot of statues. You wanted to say something? Go ahead.
Well, actually, I mean, speaking of the flaws, I think there's an aspect of our scriptures, our joint scriptures, that is we do not sugarcoat anybody in there.
Hmm.
We all the warts are present, which I think adds a tremendous amount of authority to them. There are any number of other sacred scriptures that have just, these are rose-colored glasses. We show the imperfections, and I believe that means we can trust what has been written because nobody changed it. Nobody said, "Wait, Moses comes across bad in this picture. Let's Abraham. Holy smokes! The man had issues. There's a lot of David. We do not cover over anything, and so I believe in the accuracy and of what is written, just for that reason exactly. We do not cover it up.
That's a very interesting take. That because there's imperfections in our holy scriptures
Mhm.
of the people depicted, you see it as more true and more authoritative.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
for me, what I find is like you should be able to find yourself in this and relate
Mhm.
to it. I
Yeah,
mean,
no, that also that yeah, this is I can that's the parallel part of that is because we present them as imperfect, I can put myself in the story.
Moses has some serious anger issues
Oh yeah.
and just in the Jewish tradition that we read just in the last couple of weeks. And David is, very flawed,
Mhm.
leader, given to some very modern proclivities, we could say.
Yeah, yeah. Gently put.
Thank you. Thank you. So I believe that's a wonderful way of seeing the scriptures. And what I would like to conclude with, something that we've learned together is, and this has been my latest feeling, is that, every statue that we're talking about has to be looked at individually, and
Mhm.
explored. Why was it put up? What's the history behind this particular statue? Who's it depicting? What's it depicting? I mean, we can't just take this broad, you know, um, axe to all of them. I think they all need to be examined. I do think it's clearer when we're talking about statues of Confederate generals, but when we talk about others, I mean, Jefferson, for example, who
Mhm.
obviously had a very complicated history
Mhm.
about this question, but also, wrote some extraordinarily visionary things and hopes for our country. So, we have some
Mhm.
complicated and just extraordinarily beautiful statements that we're still working to try to figure out and to live by.
Mhm.
So everyone has to be looked at. Look, this is meant as a spiritual kickstart
Mhm.
to the week. It's not an exhaustive dialogue. I
Yep.
want to thank Pastor Jeff Prey again for joining me this morning and helping to teach me and helping to elucidate some of the questions that we're looking at today. I hope, Jeff, we can do this again. I really do hope that we can see each other in person sometime soon, and not even from 6 feet away.
Well, they do have outdoor dining. We'll look into that.
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you for inviting me. Good to be with you.
Oh, and thank you again, everyone, for joining me.